You're listening to the Physio Matters podcast this month in association with rehabmypatient.com, and this is session 18. Welcome back to the Physio Matters podcast, mini landmark. 80 episodes, 80 monthly episodes. Of course, we've done more podcasts than that with all the sub-shows, etc., special editions. However, that's 80 consecutive months. It's only 20 away from that big 100. Excited for that. Massive thanks to all of you that have tuned in to last month's episode especially, which was about bringing you into a live session at Therapy Live, discussing rehabilitation as a core principle. Really popular, and people really hungry for more discussions in that direction, and therefore the MSKR Associate Directorate have then decided that thinking in public is going to be a regular occurrence, and so webinar and podcast related content of that nature is likely to be coming to you via MSK Reform. So do check out mskreform.org.uk and you're going to get more of that. Really excited to talk to you about this month's episode, but I've already mentioned Therapy Live, and it's also time for you to check out the Therapy Live recordings. We're selling them as a massive package of 73 episodes of content, which is for £50, 68p a session. Go to therapistlearning.com/p/therapy live to purchase that content. It's for sale at the moment. And the response for that has been phenomenal, much like the response to Therapy Live as an event, but particularly the recordings are going really well. And the platform we're using at therapistlearning.com, which is our curated subscription content, is really popular. So do check that out. Also, we've got a new website, physio-matters.com. Check that out. Some exciting stuff coming up on there, especially some new shows that we've got. Basically, Physio Matters is going to become a network. We're going to be reaching far and wide, doing some patient-facing content, doing some content for other specialties. So really excited to be bringing you some of that and working with some new partners as well as existing members of our team that are sharpening and leaning into their newfound skills in the podcasting and presenting sphere. So that's exciting. Final plug from me is about the Physio Matters First Steps project, which is students and new graduates that are bringing some material together to help everyone in that early stage of their career to actually translate some CPD materials, but also create their own sort of take on what it means in that space and how to navigate what is sometimes a complex landscape. Now they've got some brilliant stuff coming up, but also Farouk Bello, who's one of their team, is also going to lead on the main Physio Matters feed on Facebook very shortly. So keep an eye out on social media for a race and physiotherapy roundtable discussion that he's going to be leading for us, because obviously it's a cultural hot topic at the moment, a very important thing for us to visit. We did a podcast with Melrose Stewart, you might have seen as a special edition. But also, we want to be making sure that we discuss that amongst some grassroots clinicians, and he's going to be leading that for us. So keep an eye out on social media for that, race and physiotherapy roundtable discussion as a webinar that we'll be running very shortly. Last thing for me to tell you about is this month's episode. So this is with Ben Ellis, who's a friend and colleague of mine, who we want to discuss education, both in terms of theory and practice, what it means in physiotherapy, what it means for MSK. We've been discussing these things on and off, and it's sort of central to our general chat that we've had over the number of years. And so this is great because it's not really an interview as much as it is just bringing you into an ongoing conversation we've been having about education and the importance of it. There's something here for everyone. Especially important for us to recognise the sort of way in which education is somewhat central to current practice, both in terms of the way in which we try and instigate behaviour change and educate people is so central to practice, as well as to the next generation coming through, what it means for pre-registration, institutionalised education, us as digital educators. It's sort of really interesting chat. I really enjoyed it. I hope you do too. And looking forward to bringing you some specific clinical content coming soon as well on Physio Matters. So we've got that real diversity of different types and styles coming up in up and coming episodes. So really looking forward to that. In the meantime, I bring you Ben Ellis and Discussing Education. So delighted to be here today with Ben Ellis, someone who I've been in conversation with about a variety of things for a number of years now. An educator, he will introduce himself far better than I can, but someone that I think our kinship comes from being
sort of digital educators that are interested in innovation and disruption. He co-founded a In Beta project, which is something that I'm massively supportive of, because it's asking questions of why we do things rather than just perpetually complying within existing models, and he loves to challenge things. You might have heard me and Ben speak on his show before about some other digital innovations that we're both sort of trying to work out whether or not they're moving in the right direction. But what we wanted to get Ben on Physio Matters for is because we really want to sort of discuss educational theory as well as educational practice and its role broadly in physiotherapy and MSK education, how it sits within a wider context, and also trying to understand how this current situation that the pandemic has led us to, what it is that might move positively, and how we can make sure that we don't disrupt for disrupt's sake. What do we need to make sure we try and move back to? What models of care and models of education do we need to make sure we try and quickly return to? And what could be positive changes in the right direction that the disruption from the pandemic has caused? So there's lots of things I want to visit. Admittedly, when I was drawing up the questions, I realized that it felt a little bit false, because a lot of at least half of the answers I felt like I knew from our previous conversations that have happened over the years. So instead, the framing of the podcast, while it will be an interview, admittedly, this is us inviting you into a conversation that is ongoing. So we'll try and give you the context, but fundamentally me and Ben will have a back and forth. We disagree on some stuff, and no doubt, I know what he's like, he'll throw questions back at me. So it very much is a conversation. But before we get stuck into that, Ben, could you introduce yourself to the listeners and give us a bit of an insight into your story so far?
Yeah, cheers. So hello, I'm Ben. As Jack said, I'm a physio educator. My clinical background, so I think it is interesting in terms of how we've ended up sort of talking and falling into a conversation that we sort of pick up every few months and then drop off, and it's been interspersed with other things. Because my background's not MSK, so I'm a kind of neuro rehab physio, really. So I worked in the NHS for about 9 or 10 years in sort of community neuro rehab predominantly. Before moving into education, I did a little bit of research as a kind of bridging role, I guess, that kind of got me into academia. And then I was teaching down at Oxford Brookes University for 5 years. And I've just recently moved to the University of Birmingham, which has been extremely strange because I've yet to set foot on campus or in my office. So it's been a case of shifting jobs alongside.
Is that because is it because of the pandemic, or is it because they don't want you anywhere near them?
It's both.
Right.
So there's obviously elements there, but no. So I literally sort of started that job about 3 weeks after lockdown started.
Wow.
So it's been picking up then on kind of a whole new program and modules, and trying to kind of get started on teaching the things that I've not taught on before, but doing them in a different way. So it's been a really interesting process, just in terms of how that sits in the current kind of circumstance. But I think. I mean, I was thinking you'd sort of asked the question before about how we kind of fell into conversation, and I think really it's a kind of Twitter thing, really, isn't it? That our initial interactions, I'm pretty sure, would have come about on Twitter, and because I think that I'm someone who has an interest in the profession and kind of where it's heading, and so as you said very very kindly, wanting to sort of challenge that. I'm not one for the status quo, and I'm not one for doing things because it's the easy thing to do always. So I'm really interested in what education ought to look like to generate the kind of physiotherapists who we'd like to see in practice, and I think that actually we need often to have a better engagement with educational theory and pedagogical theory to really understand how we should be teaching to get the outputs that we're after, and that's not always an area I don't think that's talked about that much in physio, and it's one that's very easy to get very theoretical and to kind of keep within the walls of academia. Yeah, so physio lecturers might think and talk about this stuff to an extent, but so much physio education is done in practice, not just in the pre-registration phase, so not just in that sort of 3 years or 2 years or 4 years of the degree, but then the continuing educational aspect. If we've never really thought about how learning happens, how can we kind of come up with good quality CPD? How can we come up with good quality in-service trainings when we've not even engaged with those ideas to a small extent? And so I think there is I guess if there's one thing that I'd like to get more physios to engage with, it is just thinking about how learning occurs, and so what education should look like.
Sure. I think one of the things that when I look back, as I have in prep for this, to the conversations we've had over time, especially those that are in text form or when it's been obviously punctuated by a call and things like that, is what I've noticed is we're just, education is the theme, but then it's just that education as a topic spans all sorts of different things with regards to history. It can span different disciplines, specialties, contexts. The clinical application of it, where it's a consistent theme, but then that's not just placements, as you've mentioned, with regards to pre-registration. It's also application of CPD. It goes into patient education, right? Is that grossly different to interprofessional education? Do we always have to talk about sort of what the responsibility of institutions are? And with the pre-reg, that sort of is one of the things that until very recently was the only show in town in many ways, and seen as everything needed to be centralized around physio schools, for want of a better term. And so it's something that, because it's so broad, that was one of the things that was fascinating with your contribution to what became MSKR's manifesto, but also in the original Big R's project, is that because education was this banner of a subgroup within that and continues to be, it needed to become clinical education as a means of it not overwhelming it and diluting it, and it was almost too much of a beast. So what, if I was to ask you, of the various things that education represents relative to the profession or the industry and things, what most interests you, or is it that it's because all of it that makes you and why you seem to reach into all the topics?
I think there's maybe something in that I think I do struggle to pick, and so I think education is such a fundamental kind of part of the entry route into the profession. It's really interesting to me then to think about, well, what is the profession, and so as an educator I feel like a responsibility to engage with, like I can't leave anything. If there's ever any a kind of conversation about, so for example yesterday on Twitter the CSP is asking about what the 4 pillars of practice ought to be. Like that's something I'm never going to be able to leave that alone entirely, right? Because it speaks to something about the heart of the profession. I went into this job with an idea of what I thought it was, but that idea was probably relatively off, to be honest, and I'm sure that's the case for an awful lot of people. We make decisions about what job we're going to do when we're really young, and then we get sort of educated and trained into them and ways of kind of being. But I think the thing that's of interest to me increasingly is that is education as a transformational kind of process, right? So from what we think of physiotherapists might be at 16 when we're choosing A levels and we're making decisions that this is what we might want to do, actually how much of a difference, how much of a different person I am from that point through to when I'm actually then deciding to go and work in community kind of neuro rehab roles. It was nothing that I'd never considered those. I didn't know what they were, and yet I've become a physio, and I've taken on ways of being and thinking that are relevant to that profession. But equally, and I think that's where some of those conversations about the 4 pillars and some of the MSKR kind of conversations is. But what makes me a physio and not something else? And should we try and define this profession in a very specific way? Is that really not what it's about at all anymore? And so I guess the thing that interests me in trying to progress both in the pre-reg and the CPD, in terms of what education should look like, is it's about enabling like that transformation and this way of changing our person and our understanding of things, the organisation of that, and that is an educational process, not a training process.
Right.
And I feel like I'm going right off topic.
No, I'm with you. I think that's how I sensed it as well, in that we're both bothered about, for want of a better term, and it's not the right term in a philosophical sense, but it's first principles, in that we're bothered about things that do influence the foundations. And what you're describing there with 4 pillars is like that is something that if someone was to stumble across at 16, we want it to be truly as accurately representative of what they might then find if they were to be, we wouldn't want it to mislead. Like, does it truly represent what we are now? Is it something that is likely to represent something that will not need to be revised every few months? But also then, in an MSKR sense, you witnessed us, and you were helpful as a voice in helping to make sure that it clarified its message, so that it didn't then be seen to run roughshod across a profession, and purely as a URL, for example, in its first iteration, because that was just a way of doing it, as it was reform.physio. It's like, well, you need to clarify that more, because you're definitely admitting to speaking from the start about MSK practice. So why, and purely, that URL's misleading, and those things were really relevant, is because you seem to be conscious of making sure we're as clear as we can in articulating what we're getting at, but also that you're bothered about, if it's going to go to foundations, if it's going to influence those things, then the many voices need to be heard in order to not make mistakes in that direction. So we seem to, and for this podcast, I really wanted to focus on 2 things that seem to have emerged recently from the back and forth we have, which is sort of what it means in pre-registration, classically known as undergrad, but I know you've ended up being sensitive to that term because of the multiple routes to pre-registration education now, but also the relevance to CPD, and also what we seem to have found in recent years when we've talked about conferencing and things, is or unconferencing, of course, is the lingo that you prefer, is that if there's a massively divorced style of education that exists in pre-registration compared to the CPD game, of which is the only obliged education that postgraduates need to take, although it might not be the only form, rarely is the only form, it is sort of the only legally mandated version, then if that is massively divorced, then why is that? Is that relevant? And things like that. We seem to always end up talking in that direction. So I want to sort of talk initially about pre-registration, in saying that when we start thinking about physio education and people perceive it to be that institutional pre-registration style, what I would like to ask you is because we know it's contentious, and we know that what is taught, what is on the undergraduate syllabus classically, really matters. I'm struggling with that pre-registration language again there, Ben. You're gonna have to forgive that.
That's fine. You can call it undergrad, and I'll call it pre-reg.
You'll just wince and cringe on screen, right? But what I want to ask though is it that physiotherapy education is contentious, or is it that education is contentious as a societal topic and we're just witnessing our part of it? Or is it that actually, relative to education as a broader principle, physio education is uniquely contentious? Like, what's your opinion on that?
So I think you're right. I think education is contentious and it's ideological. So there are people who feel very strongly about ways in which education should be done, and I don't think that's not specific to physio. That kind of runs all the way through, from like primary school, through to any kind of postgrad education, and part of, I think, the reason for that is that it's actually really hard to empirically prove what the best way to do something is, because often the person who's ideologically committed to a certain way of teaching often has sort of some control over the ways of assessing and evaluating that teaching too, right? So if we look at like the changes that the Conservatives brought in terms of GCSEs and A-levels recently, so they went back to a much more didactic teaching approach. So what I mean there is kind of content driven, and so the teacher is the expert dispensing kind of knowledge content that the students learn, and then that being regurgitated back in the form of an exam. And you can already tell in the language I'm using that, like, this isn't something I like. Yeah, this isn't something I agree with as a way of learning. And so there was a big shift in A level. So they stopped being modular. They stopped having coursework, which are ways of thinking about education and assessing it, which enable students to kind of immerse themselves more in a project, bring different perspectives to something. An exam is either right or wrong, yeah. And so, but who can really tell? So I might dislike that ideologically, but somebody could show me some evidence that says that actually the student attainment has improved as a result of this. But obviously what they've done is they've set the means of telling attainments in the paradigm in which the education is happening. Yeah. So if we went to a very didactic teaching style and then I assessed it using coursework, there might be a big mismatch. And so, you know, and when we think about how are we seeing what's the right thing for education? So if you look at physiotherapy education, you know, more and more people are coming out with higher and higher degrees. Does that mean that they're better physios? I mean, I think probably your average graduate now is probably a more educated physiotherapist than I was when I graduated, and than probably people were before. But some of that is just the natural change. Do you know what I mean? The potential knowledge that they can have gained kind of moves on. So it always does. But does it make them a better practitioner? And that's really where we're wanting to see that shift. But no one's really evaluating that. How do we tell if someone who's gone through a certain route of training at one time it ends up being a better physio or not? So going back to the point about ideology, what that means is these are really easy topics to have you know, quite strong arguments about, because there's not you couldn't give me any decent evidence that would suggest that I was wrong, and so I can sort of double down continually into my ideology. And so that's why I think, yeah, education has this contention. And also, just to extend that point a little bit, people are invested in it because every physio has been through physio education, and most physios think that they're pretty decent at what they do, and they're right. But is that because of the education that they had, or is it because of the education plus the other experiences, or is it because of a whole load of other stuff? So people are very resistant to and tied to like a route of getting to where they are and their level of expertise, and so they often feel like the students coming through now need to follow a broadly similar path. And so change can be hard, both from the position of the educator, but also trying to bring clinicians and other people on board with a change. And you know, so one of the areas where you'd often get this kind of contention coming up is you know, a student goes out onto placement and the educator is surprised that they haven't been taught something. And I don't know how much you want to get into that, but that comes laden with a whole load of kind of expectations and ideology.
I do want to get into that, and I also want to come into some of the solutions that I think it's one of the fun places where classically, and we needn't give people the full backstory, but I just think that fundamentally, I think one of the fun things is me and you often agree on analysis and disagree on solution. But on that topic, with regards to expectation management and things, I think we found ourselves agreeing on solution with regards to, you know, managing people's expectations ahead of time. We've even I know spoken, I think, through an MSKR circumstance about codes of conduct, etc., that could be understood by the academic institution, the educator, the student, the actual the institution in which they're being educated as a student, like an NHS trust or whatever, to understand where people's responsibilities lie, especially with regards to recent developments. And we spoke about it on this podcast, I think, with actually it was on a CSP podcast of which we produced, about the fact that once payments started being made to some students in and around this COVID landscape, those things really mattered because something needed to be drawn into contract. And so we found almost that the circumstances led to better codes of conduct and expectation management because it needed to be codified. And that was a good thing as long as that codification wasn't rigid. So one of the things before we do go there, though, I would say is that because we try and come at things, and I hope most of our listenership have listened to enough of these shows to recognize that there's a mature evaluation of what it means to understand evidence, and not understand evidence when someone says that something has or hasn't got supportive evidence doesn't mean rigid, objective, empirical, data-laden. in a sense. There's a recognition of a plurality of different evidence-based methods, and especially in something like education, we recognize that the sort of very numerate, very empirical model is unlikely to understand the rich tapestry of which is human interaction when you're trying to teach and learn. So me and you don't need to do that, and I'd say we don't need to think about our listenership as expecting evidence to be just sort of narrowly defined. But it also means that because these things are ideological and therefore things where arguments need to be made and supported through multiplicity of different ways, is that the way in which you represented the argument, which you accepted and declared as being something that you didn't suit, do you think that someone who's a proponent of the recent reforms that you've described, would they describe it in similar terms? Would they consider it or accept that it's didactic? Is that part of what they're doing? And so it's almost that the representation that you naturally bring to it is so, and understandably, by the way, because I know this is an area we agree on, is that because it's something that we find ourselves not liking, that we can't help but colour its analysis, that the way in which we present it is sort of laden with some animus that actually misrepresents it, that we build a straw man that we're arguing against.
I mean, I think it's a hard question to answer. I think that someone who was a proponent of what I might see as a very didactic approach might accept to an extent that that's what they were doing, but they would probably articulate a clearer reason for needing it to be that way. So if I move that into physiotherapy education, for example, okay, so there's to my mind there's kind of two models of how education ought to start that people kind of think about. And I would say the predominant one is a kind of knowledge first approach, right? So we need to spend a significant amount of time in university to begin with, learning the facts and the knowledge and the skills that would underpin practice. And then we can go out into practice later on and begin to use them. But if we've not learned the knowledge, like, we're in no position to then try to implement it. And so I can see the argument for that, and that's an argument that fits with really a model that students would think about. So there's some interesting work done around kind of what a student's conception of a physio is as they come in compared to what a clinician's perception might be later on. And so students would feel like they need to have learnt it first and know it first before they can do it. Whereas a clinician is generally much more comfortable not knowing everything and realizing that in every clinical encounter that they have, they're never in full ownership of all of the facts of it. And so that doesn't hamstring. That doesn't mean that they're like unable to act. It means that they can act within the best interest of the patients and the best of the knowledge that they have, and that there's always scope for them to find out more. And for a student, that's really tricky. Okay, so but I also get the answer. I also get the argument that if you have no knowledge, like, you can't act at all. So clearly, students need to learn something. But I would argue that if we're not beginning to reason with that knowledge right from the start, we're not really taking a consideration of how learning occurs. Yeah, so it's kind of fact-based learning to assessment, which is often what a lot of the first year of kind of university study, not just in physio across the board, is kind of based around, with then added in complexity, added patient kind of considerations as we go through. I say that comes with a set of kind of paradigmatic assumptions about how learning happens, that we need to have knowledge first, and then we can kind of organise it and use it. And I'm not sure that that's true. If we're coming from a more sort of social constructivism model of education, then actually I need to start to play around with and use the minimal facts that I have, and then that enables me to work out what the gaps are and to add new facts in usefully as I learn them, because I'm kind of aware of what I don't know to find that out. And then when I find it out, it's meaningful to me instantly because it's plugging a gap that I've I've spotted that I have. Whereas if I have all the knowledge presented to me to begin with, I don't know what's useful and what's not, right? So I'm planning at the minute a first year anatomy module. Now, there's a lot of stuff to learn there, right? There's an awful lot of stuff to learn there. And it's all, I'm not saying it's not important stuff, it's all stuff that could well be of use for someone in their career. But to then work out, to then be presented with a situation with COVID where we've got to slim down, instead of doing 4 hours of practical a week, I might have 2 hours or 1 hour. So now what becomes essential, what's useful to know? And if my conception of this is content based. So if I've got all this knowledge, I'm like, well, all of this is knowledge that somebody might use. So I've got to teach them all of this knowledge. It's really hard for me then to make any decisions about what to strip out. Whereas if my conception of the learning that's happening isn't content based, but is more about, the principles and kind of understanding, an approach to thinking that then allows that person to, when they realize that they don't have the specific knowledge to apply this model of thinking to this scenario, they can find it and add it in. Maybe that's a better way.
One of the things that's been interesting about how I personally would have learned, my opinion on this point has been developed by the mechanisms you're describing. So in this instance, as a clinical educator that has then happened to travel around, not able to keep hold of a job for long enough, so has then toured the country, therefore experiencing students from various different institutions, means that part of my learning process is to have witnessed and understood, at least my take in the matter is that you've got some universities that have really moved towards one or the other of the descriptions that you're talking about there. And in a contextual sense, there's some that would be more what would be considered traditional models and considered progressive models, depending on where we go. But one of the things there is that I've noticed is you've got some students that clearly have been taught in a content-rich fashion that therefore haven't got understood the how to learn and therefore haven't got necessarily the reasoning. They've kind of been able to pass tests and stuff and would be able to answer questions, but actually when applying the knowledge they find it difficult because they've not necessarily been given those reasoning skills and been understood how to work in the grey areas. And especially in a profession and especially in MSK, the actual rigidity of the parameters and algorithms just got faded away by the research evidence that made us realise that there's more grey area than we ever anticipated because it's such a young discipline, a young science, a young profession. But there's also then the other side where you've got these people that can muse over if you give them the chance to, they can muse over the shortcomings of an RCT. They can give you an incredible articulation as to reasoning as a framework and social construction of education and how they're going to apply those theories with patients, but fundamentally they can't do a Lachman's. That both of those educational models, as I'm seeing the results of, are crap. If I was to try and be non-empirical about this as being sort of gospel according to true moment I accept, is that just for me, those students, through no fault of theirs, have been taught under ideologies that haven't prepared them. And so when I try and infer mixed methods there as being stronger, it's because I need them to be able to do both things. I need them to be able to do a Lachman's and understand the shortcomings of an RCT and understand reasoning frameworks and patient education frameworks. But if you miss one or the other of those, then you're leaving a really vulnerable, especially in a model where even if there's almost a justified argument for the latter, the sort of more what is considered more progressive education. But in a context in which they've been taught up to the age of them getting to a higher education institution in a certain way, the vulnerability that learner has to a new style, if you're stripping away and often quite scoffing at the education that they've had to date and the styles of learning they've been conditioned to expect, then I just think that's one of the things that's leaving us really vulnerable. Even if, for the thought experiment, that's passing all the purity tests and that's the right way of doing it, if it's so different to what they've expected before, I find that to be just a really quite vulnerable position that we're leaving people in.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. And at that point, I think is a really key one to grapple with. That students have spent like the previous 13 years of their life learning in in a way, and that way might have changed. So there might have been political changes in that time, but certainly, you know, the sort of 4 years before they come in, typically undergraduate, and that there are different routes in, and people do bring in then different experiences. But that has the more kind of exam based and knowledge based that has been, it definitely then puts the students in a very challenging situation. If I'm then going to say, okay, you know, I don't want to give you any knowledge. I want you to find all of this knowledge. I'm just going to give you, like, here's a provocation. Here's a patient. Here's something that you can now go off and you've got, and just develop the skills to find out everything you need to know about this. That's going to be too hard, right? Way too tricky. Even if that was the best way to learn, even if it's fine for education to be challenging and to be difficult, that I'm not doing anyone any favors by sticking to some ideological purity at that point. But then I think if I'm right, and if that's where I want the student to get to, so that by some point, you know, in year 2 or year 3, or maybe 5 years after they've qualified, where they're really comfortable with the grey, and they're really comfortable being able to look at a scenario and spot what their learning needs are, and come up with ways to find out about it, and then critique what they find to work out what's worth keeping and what's not. I've got to start doing that early, because the thing that I always come back to is, if that first year of university reinforces this idea of learning as being like, I'll tell you all of the important stuff, and then I'll assess you on a random selection of questions based on all of that stuff, like that sets the tone for what education looks like, and continues to then influence how the student's going to do. I think it's a change, you know, for me. It's me as an educator, not thinking about teaching. I get the sense it's the kind of thing that you might roll your eyes at slightly, in that I don't like using the term of I'm teaching this, right? I would want to think about, how's the student learning something, yeah? And so it's that change into a kind of facilitator of learning. It's providing the scaffolding, and that needs to be, that's so much more time consuming, actually, and it's where I spend an awful lot of my thinking time, is putting stuff together, so that, yes, I'm giving you a case, but I'm not just giving you a case study that can go anywhere and leaves you totally adrift in the sea of not knowing anything. But it's me understanding what are the touch points that I need you to hit in working through this. And if I can get you as a student to do a bit of the work in the first year, not all of it, I'll give you all the resources. I'm not going to ask you to go and find this stuff, but I'm not going to lay it on a plate for you. I'm not going to just do a PowerPoint presentation of what I would do for this. I am going to kind of get you to do a little bit of the work and put it together, and then tell you, you know, where that was right or wrong. That I'm starting to kind of develop a thinking process, and that's maybe where we need to be. Now, the problem with this is that this doesn't work in the economics of a university. It doesn't work with courses that have growing numbers of students, because the time taken to expose students to that a bit of uncertainty, and then need to support and facilitate their learning through that, is loads more than if I deliver what I would do as a PowerPoint and then assess some questions on it afterwards, maybe as an MCQ that marks itself. Like, that's way quicker for me. It's dead easy. I can do that, but I'm not convinced it necessarily makes the best. So it's trying to find the middle ground, which is, I think, what you were saying.
We do aspire to, and I know me and you do aspire to that. I think we've got to kind of respect sides of the spectrum enough to always want to try and find what works. I suppose, and just to clarify, is that it's not that I would inherently roll my eyes at the, you know, to some degree, I think, so, like, you don't make this mistake, but some people on that side of the argument would infer that terminology is something that is better to use in a symbolic way rather than it being meaningful. So facilitator of learner relative to teacher is something that I'm not disrespectful of that principle. I'm just frustrated at the tokenism that sometimes exists, where people will use that as a stick to beat people with, as if to infer that the baggage that comes from the term teacher is therefore something that speaks to someone's intentions when they use it. I think that there's certain moments in which it's appropriate to teach someone something, and there's times where it's appropriate to facilitate their learning. And the fact that those things, those terms, those styles of care can coexist, and that in this instance, I just think what I would love is for us to understand that And a way that I sometimes frame this, and it's an imperfect analogy, but I coined this term critical reasoning because I was recognizing that fundamentally I put an incredible value on clinical reasoning, but also that I kind of came to recognize that the act of reasoning still requires baseline knowledge, and that you can only reason with what you know to some extent. With regards to in an MSK context, this notion that you can clinically reason really appropriately, but if you haven't applied the critical thinking to the actual knowledge of which you hold, some of which is sort of historic and legacy knowledge that you don't realize that actually if you scratch away at it, it's actually really vulnerable, then you're reasoning with some flawed logic. And so this critical reasoning concept was just this application of critical thinking and clinical reasoning, because I felt that that's what, to go back to my examples of two sort of caricature institutions making sort of different mistakes within the same cohort, is that the learning institutionally has to go through the sort of, and I get criticized for overusing the phrase, but the rubber does hit the road with patients. And in this context of learning, is that those patients that are being seen by student therapists under an educator who might have been educated and be really passionate about their education and what's got them there. And they won't necessarily always recognize the plurality of different ways in which they've come to be the person they are. They often reflect instinctively over how they were taught and are frustrated at the fact that someone isn't at a position that they felt they were in when they graduated. And there's some challenging sort of social issues there in our profession to how we sort of deal with that, mitigate that, the expectation management that we talked about. But I do think that there's more respect needs to be paid whilst we try and move people, move courses, move styles in a direction which is sort of sensibly progressive in it being reasoning centric. But recognizing that if the interface for a lot of that learning is going to be through disparate clinical educators that you're not going to be able to shape and have as specialists as you can in institutional education, and that patients' expectations are the primacy of what is going to really drive some of those interactions, and so it should, for us to deliver patient-centered care, then I just think that that's the sort of thing that on a pragmatic level, rather than an ideological level, we just need to make sure that there is an imparting of knowledge at different stages, rather than it just being centered around the sort of gathering and resource giving that is sort of, I would say, fashionable at the moment.
And I don't think there's anything that I disagree with there. And I think the way I think of it is that, okay, so there's this is also possibly cheesy. There's like a quote that I always have stuck up over my desk. It's from Socrates. It's a misquote, really, but it says, "I can't teach anybody anything. I can only make them think." Now I don't think that's true, right? I think I can teach you loads of stuff. So I can teach you how to do alignments. I can teach you what the anatomical structures are of a joint. That is the knowledge and the skills I can teach, because I can do it, and then you can do it afterwards, and you couldn't do it before. I've clearly taught that, right? But I can't teach you how to be the physio. You've got to learn that, right? So it's the difference between the building blocks of it. Some of those are taught, but we can't see that as enough. It's not sufficient for me to have taught you to do alignments, of you to have learned to point out all of the different kind of bony prominences on a tibia, if you have not learned to be a physio and to use those and to also think about those with a person. So we've got to get the balance right in our education to have both of those things. So there's a model, a person called Van Merienboer, who put together this model called the 4 components of instructional design. And it talks really to what you're saying there. So it's saying that there's underlying knowledge which fits under and has to always be there and is accessible all the time. And we might have like particular inputs of knowledge that happen at different times. And then we've got to use that, and we've got to apply that in contexts where we provide less support and scaffolding. It gets more harder and the student has to do more of it. And though it's those things, that's where the learning's happening. But the teaching might happen just beforehand, and then to structure the examples afterwards. And for me, that's the nice, comfortable middle ground where we should be aiming for, that does both of those things. Because, yeah. Sorry, go on.
No, it's, I think, and it always chuffed when we do find ourselves agreeing. One of the things that interests me most about how we can actually appropriately restructure something in that sensible space that we agree on, is that clinicians love to say, why is this not taught? And educators love to say, we can't teach everything. So I wanted to ask you your opinion as to how congested is the curricula, and how is it set? What's your opinion on it as it stands? And if possible, if you can describe this, imagining we're speaking about this 6 months ago, if you don't mind, because I know there are some relevant questions that I want to get into about what it might bring and what the pandemic has done. But if we just think about it in a context of how it lies as a structure.
I mean, so my take is that it's way too congested, and it's congested because of an overemphasis on content. And so what's happened is that over years, we've had the stuff that's always been there, and we've had, like, you've got the foundational knowledge, the anatomy and the physiology, and then the assessment skills and the special testing, the palpation, and that's only talking MSK. You know, there's all the stuff to do with cardiorespiratory and neuro and everything else as well. And then we've realised that actually some of these things are maybe not as effective as we thought, and that we need to be much more aware of the psychosocial impact on reasoning, and so we've got to teach that as well, and we've got to be able to do have an awareness about motivational interviewing and how we communicate, and so we've got to bring that in as well. But it's always as well. It's always more. So there's very, very few times where we're saying let's drop that out. And so what you end up with is these kind of programs which are very swollen, particularly, and I'd be really interested, and I don't know the answer to this, to look at some of the kind of newer courses. So there's obviously been an explosion in new programs setting up over the last couple of years. And I'd be fascinated to know how they are grappling with this, and whether they are still bringing things into their curricula to begin with that, you know, are still there on some of their kind of legacy programs, or whether they're finding more space.
Fortunately, there's some of the courses that have been really thoughtful about witnessing their moment in history. Namely, you know, on a hat tip to Rena Patel, Troy Duglin at Wolverhampton, is that, and I know that they wouldn't ever want to infer that they're doing it exactly right or whatever, but I just know that they were really culturally aware of the fact that they were, that building something from scratch to some extent and needing to comply within certain models, but not having the sort of baggage of expectation of a legacy institution, meant that they knew that they were able to do something different. And lots of other people I could name in that space, if I knew their names, that no doubt had deep influence there. But some schools have been really thoughtful about and put pressure on themselves to know that they were in that cultural moment. And so there is a project that needs to be done to try and understand that, and also understand what that's meant for the students. So I hear about things as clusters of anecdotes. You can imagine through Physio Matters, people want to feed us that information about this new school, love what they're doing. It really seems to be in line with our educational values, Physio Matters, whatever they are, and compared to other schools where we're hearing that our listenership might have an opinion on mistakes being made. But how to audit that is intense, isn't it? Like, it's really tricky.
Yes, really hard. And you know, you can end up getting into sort of relatively simplistic arguments about some of this stuff. Like, you know, we should just stop teaching this intervention in its entirety. Well, maybe we could. Maybe that's an easy answer, but it probably doesn't really have a big impact on the curriculum as a whole. And it still feeds into an idea that's content driven. It's still like what's in and what's out of this content. And I'm not sure that's the right way to do it, because on any program, you know, you're going to have to, the content that ends up being on there is going to be influenced by the educators who happen to be there and what their interests are. You know, there's obviously some stuff that it would be, you know, inappropriate for someone to have gone through a physiotherapy qualifying program and not have heard about what a stroke is, yeah, or COPD. Like, there's obviously some stuff which is always going to be content which is kind of knowledge based, which is there. But then as you start to get further away from that, like, is it important that everyone's found out what Guillain-Barré is? Or the difference between a traumatic and
how to pronounce it, or
how to write it down, or where the accent goes. These are, you know, and actually, is there anything that's that important? So if I didn't turn up, if I was sick on the day when we happened to learn about Parkinson's disease, so does that mean that I can't qualify? Well, no, obviously not. But I should have, hopefully, by the end, we shouldn't be judging on the content that I've been taught, but we should be judging on the transformational ability for me to then be someone who understands, is able to make links between the other stuff that I did cover and I did learn about, and begin to already come up with some ideas which might be relevant to a person whose case is different. Because even as a first year, I'll have some knowledge which can inform something about some reasoning that I could do with somebody. And as we build it, it's about making the links between things, rather than seeing that, like, oh, if I didn't have a lecture on condition X, I haven't been taught about condition X. So if I see a patient with it, my response should be to say, I've not been taught about that before. That's problematic.
Absolutely. Well, when you think about it in the system sense, and this is one of the things that I want to get to, is that if instead, you're not needing to be taught about these 5 metabolic disorders, but you comprehend metabolic disorders, or you comprehend the broader physiology that matters underneath that. And so you missed an important day's worth of content, let's say, about hypothyroidism, hypothyroidism, but you had a similar sort of moment elsewhere in your student career as to your student learning process as to what sort of diabetes, and that it doesn't take much to start to draw on understanding those things once you understand the systems, but as long as you've been taught the linking system. And it's that idea of what foundations are that I think is sort of really fascinating, because I'm not underestimating that challenge, but it's just that there has been, in some instances, temptation to strip things that far back that it really would matter if you missed that day, because you've not actually got the foundational knowledge to apply it or link it to other teaching. It just ends up being accidentally. It's still content, because it used to be that you were getting content, but amongst that content was some foundational knowledge. Whereas if you strip it back to try and move away from a content delivery model, but don't teach the foundational principles, then I kind of get concerned about it. And I think that why I always end up blurring the lines between pre-registration and post-registration and CPD, etc. And I think we're both a bit guilty of that in a sense, is needing to talk about the whole, is because I see that if we don't start to understand our responsibility under regulation or self-regulation methods, or what our duties are as professionals once graduated, then we will never be able to alleviate some of the pressure that is put on the pre-registration curricula, because it's the only mechanism, it's the only threshold that currently exists that's ever mandated as to what you do to become a professional. That's a legally protected title. An example I want to give you there is in an MSK context, is that there's a good reason why, there's a good argument for why some of the anatomy knowledge that I needed to consume over the specific attachment sites of specific, somewhat obscure musculature is something that matters less now that we understand the ways that those things work as a neuromusculoskeletal system, as well as the fact that it's highly unlikely that there would be a really relevant strain of your sartorius. It's like, because I think that's how I come to understand it, is that I need to know this because it's going to be really relevant for my palpation skill, as well as someone pulling up. I'm going to really care because they could well have pulled their sartorius, and therefore my rehabilitation would really need to matter as to how that muscle worked, because I'd need to rehabilitate it so specifically. Now, it's foreign to me now when I think about how I would rehabilitate someone functionally, that I would need to necessarily really care about it. But then later in my career, no, I haven't picked the perfect example, but I needed to really care far more about anatomy when I started injecting people with steroids, right? And rightly so. And so suddenly, the specific anatomy in and around the pes anserine, it bloody should matter to me, especially its neurovascular components. And so if we didn't sort out, you can think about if my educational journey wasn't appropriately regulated, and for want of a better term, regulated, or just there was some sort of appropriately formalized situation that I needed to go through as someone that was about to inject people, then if you had that and you could trust that, then you could potentially take some of the pressure off the content delivery pre-registration. But if we don't sort that out, if we don't refine and improve the CPD journeys, as well as the even some of the thresholds of competence that we can create. And there's some fantastic work in this direction as well, about advanced practice being not necessarily just a role, but also something you aspire to. Then if we don't sort that out, I don't see the mechanism to justify tidying up or refining the pre-registration curricula, because no wonder it carries so much responsibility, because it's having to do all of the governance work, for want of a better term. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on that rant.
I think it's a particularly interesting one, as I said, in the context of me trying to work out what needs to be in a first year anatomy module. So thanks for the thinking there. And I think your point is absolutely right, that it's about knowledge being meaningful. So at the point where you need to learn it, because it will then stick, right? So one of the things I'm interested in, this paper flashed across my consciousness. It's only a really small thing, but they looked at some medical students and got them to retake, as they were graduating, got them to retake an MCQ on neuroanatomy that they'd done in year one, right? And their mean mark, this cohort, went from 82% or something in year one to like 33%. All but two of them failed, right? Now, wow. Obviously, by the time that they're graduating, they're much closer to being someone who you'd be happy to treat you. Yeah? You just wouldn't question that. But their knowledge about anatomical structures was poor. Was in the context of this test. But they hadn't needed to use it again since. They'd learnt it really well. They could pass their test with flying colours, and then they hadn't all the stuff they hadn't used in the intervening couple of years had just dropped right off. And we know that's what happens. And I think that's part of what then feeds these conversations on practice, because someone comes out in year 3 and the educator asks them a question and says, the student. And I'm not even saying that the student's saying this because it's an easy excuse for them. I think they probably genuinely can't remember ever being told about it or taught it. So they just say, well, I haven't been taught that. What they mean is they haven't learned it, haven't encapsulated it in a way that makes it accessible in the context that they're being asked it now, because it's not been meaningfully used since. And so this is really interesting. Like, is it important that you learn all this stuff in the first year of your degree, so that then when you then did the post-registration CPD to learn about were you actually drawing on that knowledge, or did you just start again? What you had got over that time is you got a better idea of the basic principles about anatomical structures and the things that you might need to be aware of, and then you learnt them again at a depth that was required for the task. And then as you kept injecting, it was meaningful. You used it, and so that knowledge became encapsulated in a way that it was never going to be beforehand, when you learnt muscles that you then never talked about in terms of function or rehabilitated in any way. So that's
I just think the social pressures were so different. So when I think about the way, so unfortunately, I would completely divorce them. It wasn't that I then was able to lean on. I'm glad I learned it so thoroughly back then, because I'm now able to use it almost as a refresher that gets me ahead. It wasn't the social context in which I learned it in that situation was partly because it felt like this. I was examining myself as what sort of professional I aspired to be, and that especially because MSK was something I was always so deeply passionate about. It was something that lean on this stuff. So actually, one of your stronger areas, and the formats of learning were compliant with how I'd come to learn things before, especially when revising for an exam or a test, or in our very progressive, or not in university or not. And so the ways in which I wasn't needing to label things on an anatomy textbook, it was something that was examined very well. But it's just that when quizzed on said sartorius, the contextual pressures as to why I aspired to learn then was so different to the very real, very human, like, don't inject an aneurysm, Jack logic, right? The social pressure for me to aspire to learn was such that became so, it was attached to the vulnerable people of which I was treating in such a way that I am frustrated, because I think, done well, there's absolutely no reason why slightly younger me couldn't have comprehended that. I think I felt almost patronized 5 years later to think that that couldn't have been applied. That understanding of why this, if you needed to, if it needed to be taught at that detail, then the rationale, why did I have to encounter that 5 years later? It could have been applied in that direction. The neurovascular reasons and the pathologies that you might therefore need to apply this knowledge to, if you do insist on teaching it to that level of detail, don't patronize us to think that that's because it's super relevant to the mechanics of injury rehab. Instead, mature the reasons, even if you want to teach it. And that's sort of how I do think, to answer your question, I have to divorce the learning process. It wasn't like, oh, I'm glad I taught it, here I am, I can start in third gear and get up to fifth gear quicker. No, actually I didn't. I actually felt vulnerable and frustrated and an imposter to my own experience of learning. But then again, I've heard other experiences where people have really felt like, and I know, there's plenty of instances where people weren't such an idiot that they ritually burnt all their learning materials from university once they graduated, which I did in a drunken stupor, right? So that's just an immaturity of me and speaks to what I was like as an undergraduate potentially. Whereas those that were making thorough notes and records prior to graduating were able to then draw back on these colouring books that they'd done when they became an injector. It speaks to probably their maturity back then, and that the fact that they learnt in such a way that was still compatible with them as an actual adult. Whereas, I'm not a good example in that direction because of various different things that I did and behaved.
But I think the thing you're talking about there is the contextual nature of learning, right? Yeah. It has to be meaningful. It's influenced by the social circumstances that you find yourself in. We guide that by things like the assessment. So if you're only learning to pass the test, then the drop off after that test has happened is going to be big, and you're going to feel like you can chuck all the textbooks in the bin because you passed it, you've jumped through the hoop, and no one's going to ask you this stuff again for any period of time. So like, what's the benefit of keeping it there? Whereas once it's applying into practice, then it matters more, it's important more. The social pressures, as you say, are there to learn it in a way which is going to stick and is going to make it happen. And I think all of that just goes back to the stuff we were talking about before, about not only thinking about learning as being a cognitive process and being taught stuff that is then in there. It's not fixed. It's changing all the time. Yeah. And so it is an ongoing learning. And it's not to your point there, it's not my educator's responsibility back then to have known just how much the evidence might have moved away from muscle-based specificity, for example, or algorithmic clinical reasoning in MSK terms, or what we come to understand about what you can and can't do to other people with your hands. And I don't mean in a consent sense, I just mean literally what influence you can have on people's tissues as matured. So it's not as if they knew and so condescending or patronizing wasn't the right terminology for it. The context has shifted because it's such a young and developing profession that we need to aspire to teach this like you might teach politics or sociology than it would be mathematics. And I think that we sort of almost felt like we needed to comply within more empirical sciences to be scientific, not necessarily in the learning research methods. I'm meaning that just as if there are more facts of the matter that need to be imparted, and that is a massive challenge. But I think that again links back into this thing I think I touched on towards the start, which is about really that pre-registration education is about developing the ways of thinking and practicing. So there's a physio educator called Sarah Barradell, who is down in Australia, who's done some work around sort of threshold concepts and, as I say, these ways of thinking and practicing. And for me, that's the transformational learning, that you're becoming a physio who's able to think about, yes, you're going to learn skills and knowledge, but you've got to be prepared. We've got to make sure that we graduate people who are prepared to also drop those as the evidence changes.
Yeah.
And who are constantly doing the critical reflection. And it's like the metacognitive bit of clinical reasoning, isn't it, of the reflection back, not just, okay, if I see this and this is fitting together in a picture, but does that picture still make sense? Like, what's new, what's coming out? And I think that's where then it starts to link into maybe the sort of CPD element of things, isn't it? Which is, and because I've been sort of pondering on this, that after Therapy Live, which was such a fantastic big thing, involved so many people. There's so much expertise there being shared. And like, but there's a part of me that's really like, uncomfortable with what is essentially an extremely didactic method of teaching, right? It's like presentation city, and that's what conferences are like. And as I've been critical of those. But maybe I'm coming at that wrong, because actually if the people who are accessing that are at that point where they have these ways of thinking and practicing, they're able to see how the information that's coming in relates to the knowledge that they already have, and they've got this system, and they're kind of filling gaps, or it makes them question something which is within there. Maybe actually that delivery style is much less of a problem once you've got a fairly good conceptual kind of model for practice. Do you know what I mean? That you're then adding to and refining over time.
One of the things with that, and I don't want to sound like I'm instinctively defending Therapy Live, but I think one of the things that I was discussing when thinking about whether or not to do it again and put myself and family through it again is, there's no way did the format of the 8 streams being so similar represent our typical style. As Physio Matters presents Therapy Live, people have rightly said, I was surprised to have it being as it has been. And it's partly because we did it in 8 weeks and punched above our weight in about 110 different ways. And so we needed to comply a number of speakers to a format, rather than it being like, well, how do you want to present that content, which we would prefer to do. However, if you think about what the MSKR stream did, which was sort of more panels, and the way in which where best we could, we used the technology to have really rich conversations in the comment sections, the questions, we had polls flashing up on certain sessions that people were able to interact with, handouts when they were there. But it's just that the process of what we can do with that platform will only grow. And I think that as long as, for reasons we've talked about in this conversation, we don't divorce it from some presented content, then actually I think that there is a future in that balance. And from our experiences delivering other conferences where we've completely flipped it on its head, where we had incredible speakers that then were keynote speakers that only presented for 20 minutes of a 90-minute session, right? That's our, when given the chance, when given a blank canvas, we ran a meeting for the first Big R's conference in which that was the star, right? There was a presentation to introduce context, and then they sat down amongst a panel of some peers, some patients, and had a discussion. And then the audience had 5 different ways in which they could interact, which weren't just microphones. But so I prefer that, and I agree. But then I think, and I'd love to test this, although it'd be a risky test, is if you walk it back even further than that, and there isn't a there with the content, then what do you lose? What do you lose? Interest? And therefore, on a utilitarian level, you're thinking, well, do we educate these few hundred rather than these few thousand in this way? And that sort of ends up being like a net deterrent. I don't know, but it's just that what you experienced at Therapy Live is partly because of the circumstances of time, being that how do you, almost like the mechanism of delivering that event did mean that we had to be more didactic. And I think that speaks to the fact that it's really, and it taught me that, look what is even our comfort zone. It fascinated me to think that you'd think that stripped back, you'd almost have it, people, I would assume, stripped back, given the pressures of the circumstances and time frame, as if we'd run a series of podcasts as an instinct. But instead, no, even we asked people to present on slides, and then we did a Q&A. So, it was fascinating, and I therefore hope I don't sound too defensive, but similarly, it's going to be an incredible experiment in time, which I know me and you will work on in various ways together, to try and work out what the future will hold there.
But I think what you were doing was grappling with all of the same things that as educators in higher education institutions we were doing, of going, okay, like I'd love to do all, I don't want to stand and lecture, but ultimately, like, I need to deliver some learning content, and so some of it is going to have to be in that style, in a way that I could have played around with it in a classroom much more. But as we're getting used to, but what And so that's good, because it brings me back into there, and I can see the benefits of that. And I think it's then finding out what the different approaches are, and it's not a one size fits all. And what you totally showed is that you can, what that enables you to bring in large numbers of people, and people are able to then interact with it in different levels within the same content, which I think is great. As you say, if you strip it back more, you probably end up where in beta is with Unconference, which is there is no agenda. You turn up on the day, you say what you'd like to talk about. All of us have a vote to see which of those things we'd all like to talk about, and then we start talking about it. And the idea there being, well, all of us are bringing something. We'll space out a bit, so we've got some time to go away and think about it, find some other resources, things that we might bring into that conversation. But it's much less around there being one person who the rest of us have turned up to watch. Now, look, there's space in education for both of these things. I guess that the reason that I probably sound like a loud advocate for the other way is that I think it's the unconference style, it's the active learning, it's the group discussion and the kind of emergent learning that comes out of that, which is often downplayed, in favour of a more kind of so I don't think anyone is going to stop doing presentations anytime soon, and so I'm just keen to advocate for those other ways. And I think in CPD in particular, and things like, as I said at the start, even on a really small scale, just doing it in service trainings, and just thinking about how you can start somewhere there. So on some of the CPD courses that I run, there's content where I stand and talk to slides, absolutely. But what I would try and do is I get people to have done some pre-course thinking. It's a bit cheesy, but rather than pre-course reading, so they come in with some kind of a patient example where they've done a process on, which is their normal process, and then over the course of the day, I'll try and pick it apart a little bit and say, what did you do here? Like, well, actually, that outcome measure, what was that really testing? Let's have a look at the options here. And then by the end of the day, we're wrapping it back around to say, what would you do differently with that person if you went and saw them now, based on the stuff that we've talked about? So it's trying to anchor it and get that translation then back into practice, hopefully a little bit more concrete, because you can see where you're going to apply it, rather than just have, here's a load of knowledge that I'm giving you, which the people would still sit there and think was probably very good, and they'd probably give me pretty good feedback on it, but I'd be unsure as to whether any of that is going to land once they get back into practice. And it's always that thing, isn't it, of how do we influence,
how does it actually
matters to working with people,
Rubber hits the road, as I always overuse. But what I find interesting is, I mean, me and you, and let's have it heard that Untherapy Live, why not? Let's totally turn it. And I, you've been kind enough to not dish out any "I told you so"s, because I have had that from some people that have heard mine and your critique of sort of educational formats, in which they've then politely then said, do you think isn't it interesting that when given the chance to, Therapy Live ended up complying within some of the things that you're a critic of, and I accept that, and it's been mostly friendly. But what I would say is that when I think one of the challenges that it faces, and you're right, and you're humble to accept it as being one of the reasons why you banging that drum is appropriate, is because it's seen as a minority view in which it's then trying to help people vary formats, and that you're not one that's saying that everything should be like this, because you'd succumb to some of the same mistakes you're critiquing. But I would say that one of the flaws in that model ends up being something that I would even find myself complying with, even though I'm supportive. So let's use this as an example where if I was able to attend your unconference, which I've not been able to attend in person yet, but obviously I've witnessed and heard the discussions that have come from it, I've even spoken to friends of mine that have, is that when a topic crops up, and let's just use the example of novel learning methods being a topic that the room votes on understanding, is that I'm sat there wanting to participate, someone who has opinions will travel, right? But because of social circumstances, if there's you and Jos van Vichen in the room, I find myself quite sensibly, not because I have to, not because the format wants it to, but if I recognise that there's a certain time in an hour that I could be participating in a certain way, some of that hour I would love to hear from you two. in whatever format. And I don't care how you want to deliver that, but just to general, it's not because of the expertise has been, you've not lifted yourself. I've lifted you. The social circumstance of that, you've thought about this more than me. You live and breathe it. And so that for me is where it becomes a little bit flawed. And if you think about that in Studentville, it's not that societally these poor oppressed learners have squashed themselves down to look up to these educators. It's because the social circumstances mean that quite sensibly, both on a subconscious and a rational analysis view, they do care about what you might teach them. And that's a flaw if you get carried away in that direction. Not that you do necessarily, but there are people that I see as doing.
I think it's a really good point, and then it comes back to the learning design of the how that delivery is going to happen. So, I mean, some of that can be really simple. So, for example, in that unconference for the table kind of discussions, what I'd always aim to do is not be on the table for it to start. Okay, so because if I was to stand at the front and do this organisational bit and the vote and introduce, and then everyone now go off, and then if I go to a table, everyone's going to look to me because I'm the guy who knows what to do next, right? Whereas if I then purposefully start to go and tidy something else up or go out the room for a minute, whatever, conversations have started, but then I can come in a way that hopefully moves it on. So it's not about me not contributing, but it's about me not being the focus of the entire contribution. If I set it up in a way that, okay, what I'll do at the table is I'll start by giving an introduction, and then we'll see what other people want to add. I know what I'm like. I'll spend 25 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour, and all of a sudden, like the person saying, right, we need to come back to pull this back in, and I've kind of held the floor the whole time. And I think it's how you find, again, it's just all about that comfortable middle ground, isn't it?
Unleadership, if you will. No, I like that, and again, it's always pleasing to speak into spaces where we on unpacking them, we agree even more than I think either of us might have known. One of the things that you have been having a back and forth with a little bit on social media, and no doubt giving more thought to than tweets would ever articulate, is that there's been a narrative that because of the scale of it, over 20,000 people attending a event and then engaging with content following that event and discussions that have flown from it, and lots of reflective blogs and podcasts and YouTube shows and stuff that we, most of which I haven't been able to touch. It's been a volume that's then been overwhelming. Means that there's been this narrative of it changing the landscape, and that changing the landscape for CPD MSK events was the first thing, and then it's kind of that some people have then inferred that it has changed their concept and the way that they even view education, that the whole thing's been disrupted and upturned. A combination of the pandemic and Therapy Live has meant I'm now wondering what the future holds for MSK pre-registration education, not even just MSK, but just broadly speaking. And you have been someone that has been respectfully wanting people to not get carried away on that theme, because there's this temptation to sort of deinstitutionalize to such an extent that it's almost that you would lose the baby with the bathwater. What's your broader take on those sort of the range of narratives I'm describing, as well as to where you think the line is? Because you're a disruptor that almost felt over-disrupted a little bit by some of that.
I maybe wouldn't agree with feeling over-disrupted. So I think that I would agree that it was a really positive disruption, and in particular about showing the scale, in particular about showing that CPD can be free and really high quality, and I think those are, I've been a critic for several years now about the cost of conferences, and that's the monetary cost, the environmental costs, the kind of institutional kind of cost. There's all sorts of things there, and I think what was really good to see is disruption away from that, and disruption into, because I think the other thing with conferences is that they are based on a kind of academic knowledge exchange model, which I'm not sure fits always as well as it could do with translation into practice. So what's the you know, if you think about why academics go to conferences, it's for slightly different reasons to why clinicians might go. And I think often clinicians are the poor partner in terms of conferences. They pay the costs, often out their own pocket, more often out their own pocket than academics do, to turn up and get kind of lots of presentations about what academics are doing in their research, which maybe touches very briefly on what that might mean for practice at the end on a final slide, if you're lucky, but often won't. And so those are things that I think are really positive, that you're seeing the scope for quality at scale that is clinically relevant, but drawing on, you know, with people who are, you know, experts in their field and people who are engaging with evidence. So this isn't just kind of, like a sort of a poor man's version of things, where you're getting a half-hearted
set of opinionated cowboys didactically suggesting their opinion.
Sure, exactly. So to me that's a space that is is ripe for expanding out of. I think where I think that probably the tweet you're referring to is where then people weren't then making the jump from there. So I think it should be and is a game changer in terms of what CPD and what conferences look like, and the conferences are having to adapt to that model. That's a good thing. Does it mean that this is what education looks like? Well, like in part, sure. Like this is I would encourage students to be part of that and to watch that. But for all of the reasons that we've sort of touched on already, I don't think that in and of itself that model, you know, can totally replicate that the kind of learning that you need to do, because people are going to be experiencing that in different ways. So if I've already got a conception of practice and ways of practicing, and I'm then hearing someone with expertise, and some things is reinforcing what I do, some things might be a surprise and progress it, some things might challenge that, but I'm engaging with that as a qualified clinician with years of experience in a totally different way to a student, and so I would still be, I guess, wanting that the pre-registration and even post-registration academic kind of learning to be at least mixed, you know. So perhaps it should be showing us that that we can have access to these resources and students can use those. But maybe this is like a flipped approach, right? So it's really great to listen to one of those presentations from an international expert, but then we need to probably, at the students level, bring that back and have some discussions about it and take it further in a way that is starting to build their conception, because they may not have this formed conception that they're able to integrate it themselves. And so that for me is a good space that we need to do more on. There's no point every university coming up with their own lectures that cover all the same ground. Do you know what I mean? You've just got like 100 different people doing the same lecture.
And the waste, you know, we're talking about environmental waste, but also just the opportunity cost to not leverage digital platforms, recording availability to allow for that to happen, and for people to, and the imposter syndrome that many of us face when we're stood in front teaching something that we know that there's a dozen other people that are available. And even you're competing against an actual expert's YouTube video of the same topic feels silly and inefficient in such a way that we should be more efficient. I think what's interesting for me as well is that I'm excited by how much you and I agree on the critique of Therapy Live, and I've given a bit of context as to how things emerged as they did and the opportunities that therefore not incredibly complex to do. But me and you definitely I'd love to explore this with you. You know, you're and almost, you know, I can accept that you probably would at least need to be formalized as a consultant, really, if I asked you too many questions in this direction, because for Therapy Live 2.0, I could so recognize almost a flipped model the next day, in which you then, by attending that seminar, you were also then you qualified for the discussion roundtable flavor of the same theme, same topic, with or without said expert, the next day as almost like a sub-theme, and you could almost just really use the loose framework to unconference the same event the next day or following week or whatever time frame of reflection we gave. So there's lots of opportunity of which I'm not averse to, and so it definitely was something that I wanted to bring up with you, in part to say, I'm not one that then wants to peddle that as if it's not just a game changer for the sake of it disrupting and changing the way that we think about these things, but also to infer that its popularity was narrowly due to its format. Whereas I think the moment in time, etc., was really relevant to the scale we did it at. So I'm excited for what we could do with it. I do want to ask you though, as an educator, whether it's something that I suspect won't concern you as much as it has concerned others that have spoken to me about this, is in the educational academic space, is that what do we do about the fact that some of the common threads that were through that are not, it's not students that are watching on, and even some future students that we've heard from, right, have been watching on, and because of the economy of scale, we're talking about certainly hundreds, a couple of thousand, that then found that knowledge to be, or those messages to be in stark contrast to what they are being taught. What do we do about that?
I just think we need to embrace that, but find ways to embrace that, and then so that's where it's about then bringing those things back into a conversation that acknowledges why that might be, and that it's impossible probably for curriculum. I don't know. I mean, curriculums have this really interesting duality in that. It's clearly the role of physio education to inform practice, but it's also the role of physio education to reflect practice, and so there's that forms the basis for so many tensions in terms of what should be, you know, in and out and taught and not taught and everything else, and that won't change. So, but I think that just goes back to a kind of humility and an understanding that everything should be up for question right from the start. I mean, I don't know if I've probably talked about this with you before. A session that I used to run at Oxford Brookes, you know, was with students in the first year, and just getting them to come up with something that they'd been taught already that they believed wholeheartedly. They didn't question, you know, it was like, this was obviously true. And then just got them over the course of an hour to just chip away at it, you know, and find the gap, find why it might not work, challenge it, question it, you know, go further in than they had at any point up until then, and hope that by the end of that session they'd come out going, I've not enjoyed that. You've made me much less sure about something that I thought I could take for granted, and going, yeah, that's great. So if we can just take that forward now and have that approach, if you've got at least that thought that this might be possible, it might be possible to do this with anything that anyone teaches you, with anything I teach you. I'm not right all the time. I say stuff that seems about the best take I can make it at that time, but it's not always informed by the latest research. It should be open to challenge. And so trying to find in some way in education, and I think this is on education to kind of do this, to allow those spaces where we front up to the fact that practice evolves, and that there are differences of opinions, and so we certainly shouldn't shy away from that. The answer obviously to that can't be that we shouldn't expose students to something like Therapy Live, because it might confuse them. Like that would be the worst outcome there, right? So it's about how
we laugh, and you know I agree, but then I hope you don't think that that's a fanciful thing that no one would say, because I'm hearing that as being an option, right? That we're hearing from students that have tentatively raised that have been told in some form, or sometimes explicitly, that those things are inappropriate for, you know, that will corrupt your mind, really, and that some of the things that they're talking about, and they're talking, basically it's been like students going back and saying, I've been told at Therapy Live by about 10 different people that these things are less black and white than I've been taught elsewhere, to which some have said, you know, fundamentally, no, we disagree, they're being too woolly. And then sometimes they've said, that's for, you know, once you're 5 years qualified, but actually you need to learn this way, or that actually there's the sharper edges than they're inferring. And the conclusion is, therefore probably don't go next year, or, you know, whatever it might be, or you probably shouldn't, you've probably confused yourself by attending, rather than to try and see if they could comply that knowledge within its context of, it's almost like a complacency of saying that and a loftiness sometimes to say that that's an inferior format in which you're getting a soundbite, whereas actually, you know, we're the credible institution in which we've vetted this more carefully.
I see. to me, that's more problematic if it's kind of like, okay, you know, we're the arbiters of truth here, and you should only listen to what we say. I maybe have less of a problem with somebody saying that things are more grey, and for now don't worry about that grey, because the grey can, you know, it can be confusing and is quite uncomfortable, and so there should be the role of educators to kind of, you know, how much we expose students to. That's a format of education that runs all the way through. If you think about what you learn in terms of physics, you know, in primary school, GCSE to A level, you're constantly being told, like, well, actually that wasn't true. Like, it worked, but it wasn't true. And I don't think that's a problem, to have elements of practice that are like that you kind of learn, but we should be upfront and open about it. We should say, like, for the purposes of this assessment at this time, like, this is a good start point. However, please be aware that it's much more grey than this in reality.
In primary, that's the thing. In primary, there's a massive respect for that as being a necessity, that you do supersede your knowledge and realise that the sort of falsehoods that sort of existed underneath it. And done well, it's structural, but done badly, it would be the equivalent would be that what you learnt in primary school about basic physics it's that whilst learning that, you needed to be told that the more advanced version of it, that's a bit more complicated, is actually false. It's not that that's something that eventually you'll get to. That's the thing that frustrates me a little bit, is that there's a temptation to infer a falsehood on the greyness, rather than saying that, well, yes, but you might not be there yet, and that may be confusing given the wrong context. And then the conclusion being, so don't bother with that then. And that's the thing that sort of gets blurry, is that there's almost there's a really good and sensible critique that gets lost in the sort of defensiveness of an approach that some people are really invested in, and understandably so. And I suppose it's really challenging, because the nature of something like that being so very deinstitutionalized, being, you know, very much, you know, voices on a screen, that is almost philosophically based around a conversation show, a radio show that started itself and has grown into something, is worrisome if you truly believe that one of the only ways to appropriately create educational governance is because it needs to be tethered to standards and qualifications and things like that. It's not that it's arbitrarily threatening, it's that it really genuinely makes you feel that it's always going to be inferior in such a way that needs to be put in its place. It's not always an aggressive or even defensive thing. That I have a lot of almost time for the fact that those emotions will play out, because if you really believe that, and you could even make a good argument for why these standards need to exist, then what's going on in digital education and as I said, deinstitutionalized education, or for even people like me to be considered an educator, is something that is not threatening folk because they're bothered about their positions. It's that they genuinely give good cause to dislike that model of teaching and learning and educating and all that sort of stuff, and that argument needs to be had. I just think it's such a shame sometimes if that's channeled through the learners, the students themselves, which sometimes is one of the only mechanisms of which I hear it. Like, you know, I'm not averse, and we're not averse as an organisation to hearing and confronting and learning from those critiques, but instead it feels like there is a bit of a tit for tat that goes on, and that's a shame. Do you see there being an opportunity for those conversations between more novel digital education that's happening to be very much like we are, sort of grassroots, emergent, conversation-based learning, and the more classic traditional ways? Is it just that we need to make sure we interview as many of those people as possible, or do you think that there is a way in which we could create a sort of nexus curricula or opportunities or whatever it might be?
I think there's probably loads of ways that can play out. I think the conversations should happen, and I think it would be really remiss of kind of physio educators in academia to not see the potential to engage with things like Therapy Live and Physio Matters and others to think about how they engage in, you know, this sort of translation of research into practice. And again, for me, that's a big gap. I don't feel conferences cut it. That's what the academic model looks like. And I think it's seeing that there are different ways to do it, but you have to make it more focused towards the clinician and thinking about how am I now taking this into a format that is going to be used there. And it makes sense to partner with people who are already having those conversations with the clinicians, rather than trying to set, again, there's no point reproducing something. And so it's seeing where the sort of synergies are within it, I guess, would be where I'd come at it from, for sure.
I think what I just hope for is that we can think about, I think I've just witnessed over the years such a difference between organisations and courses that have then given out some listening and watching material alongside the reading material, or to engage and understand how in context these are the sort of things that are happening, and their students interacting with those. There's such a difference between those people and those that find it halfway through third year on their own, and it feels like they've been betrayed or it's been kept from them. And then sometimes when they actually go to their educators accept on a faculty level that it's been an editorial decision to keep it kind of from them. And the difference in the way in which they engage with it and the way in which they respect the institution of which they've often paid a lot of money to, I've witnessed that be so different. And so it's been a shame, because a lot of schools are doing that naturally. It's that their instinct is, wow, we're going to leverage this free content on the internet to try and support and bolster the application, especially of this knowledge outside of placement. And so I'm not suggesting for a second that it's because of the us reaching out. They've just done that automatically. But the fact that when given a chance to, where possible, we're always up for that conversation, and we've got lots of novel examples and ways in which we could integrate our materials within that, so that there isn't that gap. It's just a shame sometimes when that gap exists and people feel a bit betrayed by what has been a falsehood in which they perceive they've been taught compared to the actuality. That gap's an artificial one that sometimes is sort of created.
I think that again feels really problematic. If it sounds like it's a control thing, right? So if the kind of university wants to say this is the curriculum and this is all of our content almost that we are going to deliver to you through there, and you kind of don't need anything outside of that, or if you do, it's curated by us, and it looks a certain way, it's a certain type of thing, and I think it's probably the same for like kind of YouTube videos from other places as well. Actually, I think that's certainly not a way that I'd have ever come at it. I think I've certainly used Physio Matters podcast as again in a sort of flipped classroom way to say, right, I want you to listen to this, and then you're going to come in and we're going to talk about some of the stuff that was in there, and I'm going to be able to use my time now to be engaging in a conversation with you, rather than have to deliver content on an area that's not my speciality. This person who's talking here knows much more about this than I do. I'd have to spend hours preparing this stuff, and I'd end up doing it in my comfort zone on some slides or whatever, because like I don't want the but if I know that we're all coming to this room at this time, having listened to this, and then we can have a talk about it, and I can now start to fit that into the other stuff for the module, because that's where that's my requirements, is to work out what are the learning outcomes I'm trying to get the students to. There's loads of stuff, they can learn loads of stuff, but is it meeting the requirements for the program at that point? And it may not be helpful for them to go off and spend all their time going really deep into things if that's then going to be problematic, because they've not got that underlying basic kind of knowledge. So being able to pull that back, being able to see where it fits in, to me, that's a good use of academic time, if I can free up some of that by leveraging, as you say, the content that exists, and being slightly comfortable that there'll be some things in there which aren't the most relevant, okay, but or that I don't agree with, or whatever, and that's fine. And I don't need to address all of those necessarily. What I need to do is then again structure the learning, scaffold the learning in the conversation, have a clear idea of what are the touch points I want to get to in the hour conversation that we then have off the back of that, so that I've used that content and shaped it in a way that definitely informs then what I'm looking for the students to work through.
That's right. It's like the most overused caveat that precedes everything these days is, I don't agree with everything they say, but, or I don't agree with everything in this book. And I'm just like, I don't agree with everything I said yesterday, but it's just what is like, what, why is that not the standard heuristic, right? That of course has been, the differences are relevant, is that you don't need to in order to promote something, especially if it's a conversation that's going to follow. It's not, there's nothing absolute about any of this. So that understanding of that as standard is exciting, because if we could work that together, then these things don't need to be butting heads as much as they sometimes do. And admittedly, as I said, it's this sort of Chinese whispers can occur behind the scenes if these things don't sort of appropriately be seen to work together. Me and you were going to chat behind the scenes on therapistlearning.com about your take on MSK education and how that fits within wider physio and healthcare education, because I know you attended a roundtable in the MSKR room at Therapy Live about sort of interprofessional discussions about with chiropractors, sports rehabilitators, sports therapists and physios talking about MSK centric thinking. And I'm definitely really excited to hear about your thoughts on that and how you feel it fits, or what the future might hold in that direction. So head over to therapistlearning.com, and if you're already a subscriber, then great, but otherwise, yeah, subscribe to listen to that. But in the meantime, just to close, Ben, I wondered if you could give people a bit of a signpost out to hear more from you, especially with regards to Inbeta, and give us a bit of an insight into where you think things are going. Not necessarily just for you, but also some of the projects you're involved in, where the future lies.
So you can find me on Twitter at ben.ellis. Inbeta, the website is inbeta.uwc.ac.za. It's a collaboration that was kind of started by myself and Michael Rowe from the University of the Western Cape, hence the South African URL. And the thing that we've got coming up that we're planning at the minute is our own conference, which is going to be online. And so that's going to be interesting because we're trying to figure through all of the stuff we've been talking about today about how do we avoid, how do I stick to my guarantee of no PowerPoint slides across a 2-day conference online. But I'm really excited by some of the things that we're going to try, and some of them may well fall flat on their face, but I hope that some of them will be a success. You can find out more on the website about that, and we are trying to definitely make that not just something for physio educators in universities, but that there'll be streams and things there that will be of interest to clinicians and students and people who have a stake in physio education. So that's the big project that is sitting alongside all of the university work. In my day job, it's trying to figure out how on earth we approach September and the start of the new academic year, which is taking up most of my time.
One day, I hope your colleagues let you into the staff room at Birmingham and get to know you in person rather than that virtual man on screen. But no, it's fascinating to have your voice in this space. Thank you as ever for your time. I know that our conversations will roll on, and I hope you guys have all enjoyed coming into mine and Ben's ongoing conversation about these issues. As you can tell, there's more questions than conclusions, but that is the nature of this topic, and also the nature of the vast ever-changing conversation that exists in this space and beyond. So huge thanks, and we will definitely speak again soon, mate. Thanks for coming on the show.
And there you have it. That was session 80 of the Physio Matters podcast. Thank you so much to Ben Ellis for that chat. Sure, that won't be the last you guys hear of him. Do check out Inbeta to discussing sort of really innovative strategies for education, and also just making sure that they apply theory into practice for understanding the pragmatic application of education across the board, be that digitally, conferences, which has been thoughtful about the way in which material is being delivered, both in institutions and online, which I can't think of a more important topic right now. And the way that Ben, certainly a must follow on social media if you're interested in that, as well as the way in which him and his colleagues are discussing the utility of placement, what it is to be foundational in education, what is essential, what is therefore optional. You know, it's just a really interesting way in which he curates those conversations. I know no one better, so I was delighted to get him on the show, and you definitely follow more of his work. As I mentioned before, check out Therapy live content recordings that we're selling at £50 for the whole package. They're not going to be available forever. Once you purchase them, you can access them forever, but certainly they won't be for sale at this price forever. So therapistlearning.com/p/therapy live. Also very easily available as a clickable on our social media, so it's not hard to find if you don't want to type that URL in. But yeah, check that out if you haven't already. Thanks for joining, and keep an eye out for various different exciting pieces of content that we've got. Now is the time to follow us at least our social media platform of your choice, even if you're not going to engage, but definitely many tens of thousands of you are doing. Certainly there's lots of exciting stuff coming up, and do make sure you keep an eye out on our news and don't just wait for the monthly episodes to find that out, otherwise you might miss something. All right, thanks a lot. Speak to you soon.
And one thing I've got to make sure that I get you to do is do the cheesy sign out before I
You know there's no way I'm doing this.
Oh, you're joking. Oh, that's so upsetting. I should have made it a prerequisite for the conversation.
What can I say? Go on, Jack. You can lead us out.
You're at least joining me in the final word of it. So if I said you've been listening to the Physio Matters podcast discussing physio matters because physio,
I believe it matters.